Search and destroy. Search and destroy was a core U.S. military strategy in the Vietnam War. The idea was to search, using patrols, helicopters, and intelligence to locate Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army units. Next, they'd set up fire bases in suspected enemy areas to lure enemy forces to attack, then overwhelm them with superior firepower. After destroying enemy forces, they would then destroy enemy bases, crops, or anything else that could be used to aid them. They would then withdraw from the area. Because commanders couldn't judge success through ground gained or lost, they measured it using the infamous body count, which was the number of enemy soldiers reported killed after an operation. The idea was that if enough insurgents were killed, then the communist forces would be worn down enough where they wouldn't be able to continue fighting. The tactic, however, became highly controversial. Body count figures were unreliable, and insurgents often moved back into the area once the U.S. withdrew. Moreover, the countless innocent civilians that were killed in the crossfire massively boosted support for the communists at the expense of the U.S.-backed South. The Strategic Hamlet Program. The basic principle of counterinsurgency is that an insurgency cannot survive without support from the civilian population. Guerrilla forces rely on civilians for food, recruits, information, and shelter. The Strategic Hamlet Program was designed to cut off that support by relocating large numbers of rural South Vietnamese into fortified, government-controlled detention camps, referred to as hamlets. The idea was that by separating civilians from communist guerrillas, insurgents would be isolated and weakened. At the same time, the government promised better security, education, medical care, and supplies inside the hamlets. It was inspired by British success using this method in the Malayan Emergency, another jungle counterinsurgency. In practice, however, the program was poorly implemented. Many villagers were moved by force, creating resentment. Some South Vietnamese officials running the hamlets were corrupt, incompetent, or secretly cooperating with communist forces, undermining security from within. In addition, Viet Cong raids, intimidation, and assassinations were common. Instead of isolating the insurgents, the program often alienated civilians and weakened the government's position in the countryside. Operation Igloo White. Operation Igloo White was a high-tech attempt to turn the jungle into a sensor field. Acoustic and seismic sensors were dropped or planted along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Once a sensor was triggered, massive airstrikes would be called on the area, intending to wipe out any insurgents in the process. The system produced a huge stream of data and allowed rapid strike responses. However, the guerrillas quickly learned how sensors worked and adapted. Moreover, the technology was limited and unreliable, as sensors could often be triggered by animals, strong weather, or civilians, which combined with the vast size and flexible nature of the Ho Chi Minh Trail meant it would never be fully effective. Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder was a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam from 1965 to 1968. The goals were to, in the words of U.S. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, bomb the North Vietnamese back to the Stone Age. The hope was that under enough pressure from aerial bombardment, the North Vietnamese government would end its support for the Viet Cong and isolate them. The campaign dropped massive tonnage of bombs, but was constrained by restrictive targeting rules and political limits. It failed to break North Vietnamese resolve. Later in the war, larger and more intensive air campaigns like Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2 used heavier strikes and fewer restraints, producing greater short-term disruption but still not a decisive political outcome. Free fire zones. Free fire zones were areas declared by commanders where any person or movement could be treated as hostile and engaged without additional clearance. They were created under the assumption that any civilians had left the area previously, so anyone left may be seen as hostile. Intended to deny the enemy sanctuary, these zones often led to indiscriminate use of artillery, airstrikes, and patrols. However, reports of the success of this method were greatly exaggerated. Many civilians couldn't or wouldn't leave the area, leading to massive civilian deaths and pushing previously neutral communities towards supporting the communists. The Phoenix Program. The Phoenix Program was a CIA-led counterinsurgency effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong's political infrastructure, especially through assassination of senior leaders. It combined intelligence and interrogation with targeted operations. The program claimed to have neutralized tens of thousands of suspected operatives, which is likely exaggerated. But in general, the program is considered to have had a sizable impact on the Viet Cong's ability to function effectively, with many communist officials acknowledging its impact on their operations and leadership structure. The program was highly controversial, however, due to its targeting of civilians, use of torture, and summary executions. The CORDS program. The CORDS program, short for Civil Operations and Rural Development Support, was an integrated civil-military pacification program created in 1967 to coordinate U.S. and South Vietnamese efforts to win over the hearts and minds of the population of South Vietnam, especially in rural areas. It combined civic action, economic aid, and security measures under a single structure. Despite many failures in Vietnam, this was one of the few areas of success by the U.S., as communist support was massively diminished. However, this success was largely hollow, as by the time it was implemented, the U.S. was withdrawing from the South under political pressure, allowing the communists to eventually sweep in and take the whole of the South. Project 100,000. Project 100,000 was a recruitment program launched in 1966 to address urgent manpower shortages in Vietnam. Its goal was to bring in at least 100,000 additional troops by lowering medical standards and, most notably, reducing the minimum IQ requirement for enlistment. The recruits were mockingly nicknamed McNamara's morons, and the program quickly became controversial. It was initially presented as a social initiative that would provide disadvantaged young men with job training, education, and opportunities for personal development. However, many recruits didn't even realize that they could be deployed to combat. Once enlisted, they were treated like any other soldier. Unsurprisingly, these men experienced disproportionately high casualty rates, along with elevated levels of combat-related mental health issues such as PTSD, which in many cases affected them for the rest of their lives. Many observers argue that a key motive behind the program was to meet military manpower demands without expanding the draft further into the middle classes, which would have been politically sensitive. After the war, the program drew significant criticism, with detractors contending that it exploited vulnerable young men while failing to deliver the long-term benefits it had promised. Operation Ranch Hand. Operation Ranch Hand was a direct way of trying to combat one of the biggest issues for the U.S. forces in Vietnam: the jungle. Thus, their solution was to remove the jungle from the equation. This involved spraying millions of gallons of defoliants and pesticides, especially Agent Orange, to remove jungle cover and destroy crops. The goal was tactical: deny the enemy concealment and food. Alongside this came the use of roam plows, which involved using bulldozers to destroy the jungle, especially around fire bases or other strategic strongpoints. Napalm was also used to destroy cover and fortifications. These methods had immediate tactical effects but caused starvation and disease to the civilian population, as well as to many U.S. troops, from crop destruction and chemical exposure, as well as massive environmental damage to the country which is still felt today. The McNamara Line. The McNamara Line was an ambitious plan to effectively seal the borders of South Vietnam from further insurgents and support. Knowing that the only favorable outcome would be the south of Vietnam resisting the communist tide, they decided to take unorthodox measures to seal the South in. This was done through covering the borderlands with sensors, mines, and fortified positions to detect and interdict enemy movement. Additionally, in coordination with Operation Ranch Hand, much of the jungle in the borders was destroyed to make enemy targets more visible. The project, however, was mostly a failure, as it was extremely expensive, and communist forces quickly found ways to adapt to the measures or even sabotage them. Operation Wandering Soul. Operation Wandering Soul was a psychological warfare campaign designed to exploit Vietnamese beliefs and superstitions surrounding the spirits of the dead. U.S. forces broadcast recordings of eerie voices, ghostly wails, and messages said to be from dead children and fallen Viet Cong fighters, calling out to their comrades, urging them to return home to their families. The aim was simple: to frighten, to demoralize, and to encourage desertion. The recordings were usually played at night, when the jungle was at its quietest, to heighten their psychological impact and to deprive insurgents of rest. Here's a clip from one of the tapes. The results were mixed. Although it was officially described as a success, the reality was often very different. The most common impact once a recording began was it revealing the U.S. position and the communists firing at them. The United States also employed other audio tactics, like loudspeakers, or even sonic booms intended to disorient and deafen communist forces, all as part of a broader psychological operations campaign. Cambodian incursion. In 1970, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces launched an incursion into eastern Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese and Viet Cong sanctuaries along the border that supported operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The move expanded the war into officially neutral Cambodia, sparking widespread protests in the United States. Militarily, the operation briefly disrupted supply networks and captured large stockpiles, but failed to stop the flow of troops and equipment. Politically, it destabilized Cambodia, intensified its civil war, and helped create conditions that enabled the rise of the Khmer Rouge and their brutal regime. The Open Arms Program. The Open Arms Program was designed to encourage defections from the Viet Cong by offering amnesty, money, and reintegration assistance. Leaflets, broadcasts, and safe conduct passes were used to persuade fighters to surrender. The program had mixed results. Hundreds of thousands of people defected over the course of the war, including some guerrilla fighters and local supporters. However, many defectors were low-level personnel, and some later returned to the communist side. Others joined mainly for safety or material support rather than genuine political loyalty. Overall, the Open Arms Program did bring in valuable intelligence, but it did not significantly weaken the overall strength of communist forces. Project Eldest Son. Project Eldest Son was a covert sabotage program that aimed to sabotage enemy ammunition and supplies. Instead of attacking fighters directly, U.S. forces secretly planted booby-trapped ammunition into Viet Cong and North Vietnamese supply chains. A small number of rifle and machine gun rounds were altered to contain high explosive charges. When fired, the sabotaged cartridge would detonate inside the weapon, destroying the gun and often killing or severely injuring the person using it. The goal was to undermine enemy confidence in their weapons and ammunition. While the operation caused some casualties and mistrust, its overall impact was limited. Once the North Vietnamese became aware of the tactic, they improved ammunition inspection as well as distribution controls. The CIDG program. The Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or CIDG, recruited and trained indigenous Montagnard tribesmen as local militias to defend highland areas and gather intelligence. Run initially by the CIA and later supported by U.S. Special Forces, the program produced effective local units with deep knowledge of terrain and enemy patterns. However, political neglect after the war left many Montagnards vulnerable, and the program's long-term promises to these communities were not fully realized. Light at the end of the tunnel. The light at the end of the tunnel message was a public relations strategy used by U.S. officials during the Vietnam War to suggest that victory was on the horizon. Leaders such as General William Westmoreland gave optimistic briefings, pointing to rising enemy body counts and claiming communist forces were weakening. The aim was to reassure the American public that the war was winnable and progress was being made. However, the strategy was massively undermined by the Tet Offensive in 1968. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually regained control, the scale of the attacks contradicted earlier claims that the enemy was close to defeat. The gap between official statements and battlefield reality deepened public mistrust. As a result, confidence in government leadership declined sharply, contributing to a surge in anti-war protests and wider political unrest across the United States. Vietnamization. Vietnamization was President Nixon's policy to transfer combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces by building up, equipping, and training the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The goal was to allow U.S. forces to withdraw while leaving a viable South Vietnam in place. In practice, Vietnamization improved ARVN capabilities in some areas, but it was implemented in a rushed manner due to political pressures at home. The U.S. withdrawal, combined with continued North Vietnamese pressure and political instability in Saigon, meant the strategy never had the sustained support it needed to secure a lasting favorable outcome, ultimately leading to the fall of Saigon almost immediately after the U.S. withdrew the bulk of their forces. While initially the U.S. tried to fight a conventional war against the communist forces, this quickly changed into a guerrilla war completely alien to the central doctrine of the U.S. military. Despite these often crazy and unorthodox strategies, they highlight the desperate nature of U.S. forces in Vietnam to win a war unlike any they had previously fought in.